Hi guys, so we are going to take a look at what you should know about politics, but don't. We're looking at chapter 1. We're going to skip over the intro, but just really quickly discuss the kind of the question for the introduction, which has to do with political parties, and then we're just going to jump right into chapter 1. I am recording during the school day, so if you see some sudden breaks or changes of scenery or outfit, that might be an explanation for that. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is look at this introduction question. So it says, on the line below, write down the names of political parties as they apply to the terms left and right. So you would look at left and right. And in this case, when we're talking about left and right, we're talking about the difference between liberal and conservative. So liberal left, and then the conservative right. Okay, so they mention a bunch of different political parties and political groupings and ideals throughout the introduction. I can't really write on this line. Maybe I can. Let me see. Okay, so on one side, we're going to have liberal, and on the other side, we're going to have conservative. Okay, so as we look at this line, you're going to have progressives are pretty far left. And then you're going to have Democrats who are still left-ish, but they fall towards the center. Right in the center, you're going to have moderates. Okay. And then even more, they're still towards the center, but heading pretty right. You're going to have Republicans. More right than them, you're going to have Libertarians. I apologize if that's not how you spell that. You might correct me. Okay. And then you're going to have populists. Okay, so these might be, some of these you might know, and some of these might be kind of new groups or new political ideas, so I would take a look into some of these. But this is a really good way to kind of look at how our current political system works. So you can see that our two-party system that we mainly use is Democrats and Republicans, and they both fall sort of towards the center. They're not really as far left or as far right as either side will try to make you convinced that the other side is. So it's just a good thing to take a peek at. All right, so we're going to take a look at Chapter 1. I'm going to read through it, and then we're going to talk about some of these questions. We'll go through them as we go. So Chapter 1 is on elections, so super relevant to what we're dealing with today. Both national and state elections are run by state governments. There is enormous variability in voting mechanisms among states. Voter registration is thought to disproportionately affect minority, disadvantaged, and younger voters by making it less likely that they will vote. Supporters of increased voter requirements worry about fraud, but others contend that voter fraud is minimal. Concerns have been raised over the security of DREs or direct recording electronic voting machines such as touchscreen machines. So typically what will happen is when you vote, you have some sort of paper backing to it. So like either it's like a punch system or you physically fill out a ballot and it's a paper ballot and then they count that way. So there's some sort of paper trail. McCain-Feingold was a major campaign finance reform bill passed in 2002 that targeted soft money contributions, and its effects are still being debated. Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission was a landmark Supreme Court case that undid several provisions of the McCain-Feingold and brought soft money back into politics. Gerrymandering is the practice of drawing congressional districts to influence the outcome of elections based on demographic information. Used by both parties, it can render some voters' interest almost irrelevant and tends to help incumbents or people who were already in the position. So Gerrymandering is when they go and they create these kind of like zigzaggy districts so that more districts will vote in a certain way. It's kind of hard to explain, but gerrymandering is interesting to look at. There's a lot of really good YouTube videos on it. The Republicans' Texas redistricting plan drew fire in 2003. Democratic presidential nominations rely on primaries. New Hampshire's early primary and the Iowa caucuses are especially important. Republican presidential nominations are more centralized. The South Carolina primary is important, as are early non-binding straw polls. Many states have moved their primaries forward in order to gain more influence over the presidential nomination process, leading to an earlier Super Tuesday. And there have been calls to reform the Electoral College, which elects the president and vice president. Many would prefer direct election via the popular vote, and that's been a big discussion. So the Electoral College essentially says that however a state votes, if the majority of people in that state vote for a certain candidate, that usually the electoral votes will go to that candidate. Sometimes they divide it up. It's a little bit tricky, but essentially you're not directly voting, and so in a lot of elections, the person who wins the popular vote, or the person that the most people voted for, doesn't actually end up winning the election. And some people think that we might need to change the Electoral College in order to make sure that the popular vote, or what people actually want, is being respected. So, background to current debates. Most Americans know that we use a simple majority system to elect senators and representatives, and many have heard of the Electoral College, but few of us understand how a candidate gets his or her name on the ballot, or even how ballots are counted and tallied. We know even less about the groups that maintain a continuing interest in how we choose our leaders on the local, state, and national levels, but almost every aspect of voting can be contentious. After all, how an election is held can strongly influence who is elected. Electoral processes are at the heart of the democratic government, but they aren't usually political issues because they are complex, are local rather than national, and vary by state, county, and even precinct. For some critics, this fact in itself is problematic. They feel a uniform national mechanism would be inherently fairer. Few of us are ever so aware of problems that may exist, except when a race is so close that irregularities could affect its outcome. That's all the more reason to pay attention to elections before they go wrong. Every current debate about elections is somehow informed by the 2000 presidential race between then Republican Texas Governor George W. Bush and Democratic Vice President Albert Al Gore. Though the election was the most closely contested in decades, it was less anomalous than we might think. In fact, several elections in the 1800s were just as close and heavily debated, and had similarly vast repercussions on American history. An issue that during the 2000 election that caused difficulties in other elections was a conflict between the outcome of the popular vote and the outcome of the Electoral College, one of America's least loved and probably least understood institutions. The Electoral College consists of 538 electors. They are the ones who actually elect the president and vice president, not the millions who cast their vote on Election Day. There is one elector for every U.S. representative and senator, plus 3 for Washington, D.C. So California has 54 electors, Delaware has 3. The way electors are nominated varies by state, but we elect electors loyal to a particular candidate by voting for them on Election Day. If you read your ballot carefully, you may see that it actually says the electors for the various candidates for president and vice president. Since their position is never disputed, and there's no contest for the position on the ballot, many of us simply never notice that we vote for electors. We just check the box next to the candidate's name. Electors meet in their state capital 41 days after the general election and, with rare exception, cast all their state's votes for whichever candidate won a plurality of the popular vote in the state. A plurality just means the biggest percentage of votes. A majority means more than 50%. Okay, so they go and they meet and they cast all their votes for whoever won the popular vote in that state. The Electoral College was created by the Founding Fathers as a last-ditch compromise on how to choose the president. one of the most hotly debated questions faced by the Constitutional Congress in 1787. Some wanted Congress to choose the president, thinking that they would be best informed and would choose the most qualified candidate. Others argued for direct election by the citizens as a more democratic and egalitarian method. The solution was to have state legislatures elect representatives to the Electoral College, whose members would subsequently choose the president. Soon enough, there was a problem. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr each received 73 electoral votes, so the decision passed to the House of Representatives as dictated by the Constitution in case of a tie in the college. Jefferson won, while Burr went on to kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel. And you think today's politics are cutthroat? The 1824 and 1876 elections were also decided by the House, both times electing someone who had not won the popular vote. In 2000, Al Gore won the popular vote by 600,000 votes, but lost Florida and its 21 electors by only 937 votes. He lost the Electoral College 271 to 267. Early on election night, Gore appeared to be winning Florida comfortably, and major networks called the state in his favor. Experts often call an election based on projections, knowing some of the results. They use exit polls and statistical analyses to guess the remainder. But later that night, Florida was called for Bush, giving him a projected majority in the Electoral College, and he was declared the winner. The following morning, however, Florida was deemed too close to call, and the entire election was thrown into limbo. The margin was so close that an automatic recount was ordered to determine the winner. Democrats were concerned that the recount effort was effectively fixed in advance because the official in charge was Republican Secretary of State Katherine Harris, the co-chair of the Bush campaign in Florida. Harris's boss was George Bush's brother, Florida's Republican governor, Jeb Bush. Republicans responded that any recount would present opportunities for fraud and insisted that the election was over and Democrats were trying to steal it. Allegations of unfair voting practices flew thick and fast, and both sides filed lawsuits, but some of the problems weren't necessarily partisan. Ballot design was an issue. One county used the now infamous butterfly ballot that made it quite easy to vote for a different candidate than intended. Some people realized their mistakes and ended up voting twice, avoiding their ballot. Other conflicts erupted over how to count ballots marked by punch card voting machines, which rely on voters using a mouse stylus to punch holes into a cardboard ballot. This is what created the notorious hanging chads, produced when the small piece of cardboard meant to be punched out did not detach completely. Some counties counted hanging chads as votes, while others did not. These mechanical issues led to political fistfights. Democrats said that voters' intentions were what mattered, so all the ballots should be recounted. Plus, they proposed that disputed districts hold runoff elections, which they expected Gore to win. Republicans wanted to avoid this and countered that Bush's victory should be deemed final. They also argued that a runoff would be unfair because it would alter the circumstances of the vote and give runoff voters extra influence. Some accounts of the recount allege flagrant fraud, including the theft and destruction of ballots and the intimidation of election officials by angry mobs allegedly bussed in by the Republican Party. Meanwhile, news reports followed the rising and falling vote totals like the stock market, and Bush's margin of victory slowly shrank. It was unclear how the debate would be resolved. Would it be thrown to the House? In that case, Bush would surely prevail as the House was Republican-controlled. There was no precedent for a national recount or re-election. The Constitution and federal statutes are both silent on this. Florida, meanwhile, had a self-imposed deadline for reporting its result. While the recount continued, so did the lawsuits. One reached the Florida Supreme Court, which ordered that the recount continue, and Bush appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court's 5-4 ruling in Bush v. Gore stopped the recount, judging it to be unconstitutional, and stated that no alternative method of deciding the vote could be found before Florida's self-imposed reporting deadline. To Democrats, this was insane. How could determining the intentions of voters be unconstitutional? The court's opinion decided that there was no uniform statewide standard for determining whether or not a vote was valid. The recount violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The real nail in the coffin, however, was the court's conclusion that there simply wasn't enough time to come up with a new result. The court split among the conservative liberal lines, leading most Democrats and some Republicans to say that the decision was partisan. There were several post-election analyses, and the consensus is that under the rules the Bush camp proposed to resolve the dispute before it went to the courts, Gore would have won, while under the rules the Gore campaign proposed, Bush would have won. Major press organizations asked the University of Chicago National Opinion Research Council to conduct an investigation to determine what the outcome of a recount would have been. The NORC concluded that either Gore or Bush would have won, depending on how ballots were counted. Independent recounts by USA Today and the Miami Herald showed that Bush would have won a hand recount of the disputed ballots, but a recount over the whole state would have been given to Gore by a narrow victory. Basically, more Floridians intended to vote for Gore than there were votes counted for him, indicating that there had been a runoff in various counties. The outcome probably would have favored Gore. Many Democrats remained convinced that the election was effectively stolen. Democrats in government had one chance to challenge the Supreme Court by objecting to the Florida's electoral votes when they met, and they always must, to certify the election. 20 representatives formally lodged objections, but these must be presented by both a representative and a senator to take effect, and no senators rose to register a complaint. This enraged many progressive Democrats who found the official party response to the Florida debacle craven. Republicans, on the other hand, felt that justice had been served by leaving the original electoral results alone. In any case, Gore submitted to the Supreme Court's decision, and George W. Bush became America's 43rd president. After the problems during the 2000 election, in 2002, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, which helped precincts replace punch card voting systems and attempted to establish voting standards. The entire Bush-Gore experience led to a more public scrutiny of voting mechanisms, and the extra attention has been paid to more partisan debates. Indeed, many voting issues, from registration to counting, are highly partisan, so highly on one side or the other. Some, like gerrymandering, aren't partisan, but involve politically independent advocacy groups. But first, let's see how candidates become elected officials. So let's take a second and look at question number 1. So why is the case Gore v. Bush considered to be such a stain on American democracy, and did the country's leadership handle it properly? Okay, so this is the presidential election in 2000. Essentially, it was so close, they said it was too close to call. And it ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court was who made the decision as to who became the president. Okay, so the reason it's such a stain on American democracy is it showed that we didn't have a standard way of handling these arguments or these disagreements in our election system. You can even say that many people believe that the opposing party stole the election. The election was eventually decided by the Supreme Court because they didn't have a way to hold a recount or a runoff. Okay, and then you have to answer, did the country's leadership handle it properly? So from what we just read, do you think that the country's leadership handled that properly? Keep in mind this has been a big discussion, especially related to the Supreme Court now, because we have a possible or probable appointment to the Supreme Court by President Trump, Amy Coney Barrett, and if she gets appointed to the Supreme Court and there is an issue with determining who won this upcoming election, that might end up going to the Supreme Court. There's now two justices on the Supreme Court who were appointed by Trump. So the question is, are they going to pick Trump's side in any sort of disagreement over who won the election? That's something we're going to have to see. So if you need some time, go ahead and pause the video. So, mechanics of voting. In most states, you have to register to vote, usually 30 to 60 days prior to the election. The rationale for registration is to prevent voter fraud by allowing state governments to keep track of who has voted, but it has had the effect of making voting harder, and therefore less likely for many. Studies have shown the popular interest in a campaign peaks in the final 2 or 3 weeks before an election, but by then it's too late to register in most states. Plus, registration laws disproportionately impact people who change addresses more often, especially the poor and less educated, as well as younger voters. Several states have same-day voter registration. A few have none at all. Calls for states to adopt same-day registration, which balances fraud prevention with accessibility, have grown in recent years. Both Republicans and Democrats make a point of helping likely supporters register. But many registration groups are nonpartisan and operate out of a sense of civic duty and political engagement. Many get-out-the-vote programs provide transportation and or childcare to encourage voting among lower-income individuals, for whom it may be hard to get to the polls because they work several jobs, don't have a car, or can't find a babysitter. Ironically, voter registration itself is sometimes a conduit for voter fraud. Voter registration services can selectively destroy or file applications. In 2004, such allegations in Oregon received national attention. In 2009, the nonprofit Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, or ACORN, was embroiled in voter fraud controversy. ACORN was a low-income advocacy group that worked across the United States and in several other countries to help with issues including health care, violence prevention, housing, and tax advisement. ACORN, like many community action nonprofits, held voter registration drives. Also, like many organizations, they paid coordinators by the number of people that they registered, which, pretty unsurprisingly, meant that people made up fake names and submitted fraudulent voter registrations. Some ACORN offices seem to have had the problem for years, and faced criminal charges from Republican and Democratic state governments alike. But filing fake voter registration does not equal improper voting. People would have to illegally vote under these assumed names for that to be the case. ACORN was finally felled by 2 conservative activists who posed as a couple trying to get advice at ACORN offices for illegal businesses such as running a child prostitution ring. They secretly filmed ACORN employees responding to their requests. Though ACORN was cleared of any criminal wrongdoing by several agencies, investigators found the videos were heavily edited. The damage was done, and Congress revoked ACORN's federal funding, which basically shut the organization down. Voter suppression and voter intimidation are variations on voter fraud. Voter suppression often entails misinformation. People are told polls are closed, or there's requirements for voting that don't actually exist, like showing a social security card or a government-issued photo ID. Sometimes the intimidation is physical. A heavy, though fake security presence may be displayed at polling locations. Sometimes voters are aggressively questioned outside the polls. Typically, voter suppression and intimidation target low-income, socially marginalized populations. There were reports that voter intimidation and suppression in Florida in the 2000 presidential election affected mostly poor African Americans who were expected to vote for Al Gore. People for the American Way, a nonpartisan though left-of-center watchdog organization, asserts that voter intimidation occurs nationwide and is not the province of a single political party, though patterns of intimidation have changed as the party allegiances of minority communities have changed over the years. Some of these actions are illegal under the Voting Rights Act of 1965, passed under Democratic President Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, to extend the franchise or the right to vote, especially to African Americans in the South. The Voting Rights Act reflects what we perceive as the right to vote. However, no blanket right to vote is guaranteed by the Constitution. Subsequent amendments removed restrictions on the rights for certain people. African Americans theoretically in 1870's 15th Amendment, women in 1920's 19th Amendment. The Voting Rights Act permanently and nationally abolished literacy tests and poll taxes or payments required in order to vote. These had been especially prevalent in the South as part of Jim Crow laws, which included forced segregation and numerous restrictions on African Americans. The Voting Rights Act forced some states, counties, and towns to pre-clear all changes in voting practices with the Department of Justice. It had also had a partisan impact, as African Americans shifted their allegiance to the Democrats, while formerly Democratic white Southerners began trending Republican. The voting section of the DOJ has faced scrutiny for its implementation of the Voting Rights Act. In 2005, the DOJ approved a program in Georgia that would require all voters to show certain kinds of ID at polling places. People who could not provide appropriate ID would buy a $20 digital ID card. Republicans argued that it was a necessary measure to vote against voter fraud, while Democrats feared it would make minorities less likely to vote. Low-income African Americans in Georgia are mostly Democrats, so Democrats saw this move by the Republican-controlled legislature as an underhanded political swipe. Under the Voting Rights Act, Georgia had to submit its changes in electoral practice to the DOJ. An initial internal report by the DOJ suggested that the Georgia ID requirement would dilute minority votes because significant numbers did not have the necessary documentation. However, Section Head John Tanner allowed the ID program to move forward. The Georgia law was overturned by an injunction. That decision was reversed, and then in 2008, the court upheld an Indiana law requiring voter ID. Texas, Tennessee, Rhode Island, and Kansas passed new state voter ID laws, activating in 2012, bringing the total number of states requiring ID at the polling station to 30. Sometimes proponents of ID laws said they want to prevent illegal immigrants from voting. Immigration advocates, however, point out that no illegal immigrant would risk arrest and deportation in order to vote. Although many civil rights groups have condemned and challenged voter ID laws, the tide seems to have turned in favor of stricter regulation. In 2011, however, a blow was struck against such laws when Obama's Attorney General, Eric Holder, controversially rejected an attempt by South Carolina to require one of 5 kinds of ID at the poll. The Justice Department ruled that the South Carolina law would selectively disenfranchise minorities because 10% of non-whites in South Carolina don't have a photo ID, while only 8.4% of whites lacked a photo ID. Some who support ID laws accused Holder of playing racial politics in advance of a 2012 election. Others pointed out that the percentage difference between white and non-white without ID was extremely small, and argued that the Justice Department acted against the Supreme Court precedent, as well as Department of Justice precedent. Indeed, in 2008, the Supreme Court ruled that an identical law in Indiana requiring voter ID at the polls did not create an undue burden on voters. So, if Indiana could do it, why not South Carolina? Well, unlike Indiana, South Carolina's voting laws must be pre-approved by the Justice Department under the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Non-whites in South Carolina are not as disenfranchised as they were in 1965, and many argue that maintaining these distinctions in the present day is unfair. It may very well not stand up in court. On the other hand, in 2012, a Wisconsin judge ruled that a similar law there was unconstitutional. The direction in which voter ID laws will go is not clear and for now is being played out on the state level. Under President Bush, the DOJ was also accused of selectively implementing the 1993 National Voter Registration Act. The NVRA requires states to help welfare recipients to register to vote. It also contains directives on who cannot vote. Some groups, most of them liberal, argue that the DOJ under President Bush forced purging of voter rolls rather than registering voters. They contend that there was partisan political effort because those people who are not registered and cannot vote are more likely to be Democrat. Lately, allegations of voting irregularity have tended to fall on Republicans. But in many big cities in the mid-1800s, the mid-1900s, Democrats were often implicated. The political machines that ran urban areas were mostly, but not always, Democratic, providing jobs and other social services to recent immigrants in exchange for their votes and support. This was easier to monitor before our system of public ballots was instituted. In those days, most votes were cast in public without a booth. Reformers criticized the most infamous machines, such as New York Tammany Hall, for paying for votes or encouraging people to cast multiple ballots. As a result, the first voter registration laws were passed around 1900. In 1960, Chicago's Democratic Mayor Richard M. Daley was accused of running up votes for Democratic Senator John F. Kennedy's presidential bid. That election was very close, and many believed that Kennedy had won Illinois and ultimately the presidency because of Daley. A number of investigations concluded that while there were some voting irregularities, they were minor and didn't affect the statewide outcome. But the belief that Daley fixed the election was widespread. Kennedy's vice president, LBJ, was accused of similar dealings in Texas, which was then predominantly Democratic. So we see two basic patterns to electoral disputes. The party alleging irregularities is always the party that just lost. The winners, of course, are content with the results. And since Democrats have tended to rely on more of the votes of working class and African American voters, they have a stronger incentive to make voting more accessible. Conversely, Republicans have been more likely to allege voter fraud and to support tighter restrictions on voting. Controversy has dogged many elections for the House of Representatives as well. The number of representatives in Congress is currently fixed at 435. Each state has at least one. The more populous the state, the more representatives it has. Wyoming gets a single at-large representative, while California has 52. In states with more than one congressman or congresswoman, each represents a physical area of the state. Creating these districts is often more a matter of extreme political debate because of how districts are drawn affects who is elected. Okay, I'm going to pause here for the bell.